Now I'd like to invite Dr. Mark Diesendorf to speak. He was trained as a physicist and was a pioneer of wind power in Australia. He now researches and campaigns on the energy and sustainability transition. His latest book is The Path to a Sustainable Civilization.
Thank you very much. I was asked to talk about nuclear power, but first I would like to say something about the American nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. With the benefit of hindsight, that bombing was probably unnecessary from a military point of view. By the beginning of August 1945, the United States Air Force had almost complete control of the airspace over the whole of Japan. And that's demonstrated by the fact that the B-29 bomber that dropped the atomic bombs on those two cities was not escorted by military aircraft at all. It was perfectly safe. It could fly over Japan without being worried about being attacked. So Japan was in fact in early August totally surrounded by the US military. Nothing could go in or out, essentially. It would have had to surrender eventually as it ran out of food and fuel and other supplies. So why did the Americans drop the bombs? Well, after they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima, which had some military significance, on the 8th of August, 2 days after the initial bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, which was controlled by the Japanese on the East Asian mainland. And the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. And we now know from historical analysis that that was the main reason that drove the military establishment in Japan and ultimately the emperor to decide to surrender. They were aware of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, but it hadn't really registered very much because the Americans had been bombing 60, 70 cities of Japan, sometimes with firebombing, and the significance of the atomic bombing didn't really strike home to the military establishment in Japan. So, why then did the Americans bomb Nagasaki, which was not a military target of any significance, on the 9th of August? They bombed it partly, as we now know, to send a message to the Soviet Union that after the war it would be the Americans who would be in control of Japan, and that the Soviet Union would better keep its distance and better keep out. That seems to have been the main reason. So the US nuked Japan in order to get a rapid surrender before the Soviets could actually invade the country of Japan itself. Now, the nuclear explosives used on Japan, in Hiroshima they used highly enriched uranium, the same kind of highly enriched uranium that nuclear submarines use, the American nuclear submarines. And just to be sure that they could use nuclear weapons with two different explosives, Nagasaki was bombed with plutonium, which comes from the spent fuel of nuclear reactors. Now, since that period, we have so-called peaceful nuclear power, or I would call civil nuclear power, and that industry is capable of producing nuclear weapons, nuclear explosives, by both methods. If you have uranium enrichment, you can enrich the uranium further to make nuclear bombs. The more you enrich it, the smaller the bomb, easier to deliver. With plutonium, that too is very effective. Now, you heard a number of countries that have developed nuclear weapons, but what I'd like to add to that is that quite a number of countries that develop nuclear weapons use the nuclear power fuel cycle. The British government, with its first generation of nuclear power stations, reprocessed the spent fuel to extract the plutonium and used that so-called peaceful nuclear fuel to supplement the fuel obtained from military reactors. In France, the civil and nuclear weapons programs are indistinguishable. They use the same facilities. India used nuclear power technology from Canada to develop its nuclear weapons. Pakistan had a very enterprising nuclear physicist who worked on nuclear power at the Urenco plant in Europe, which is meant to be a civil part. He came back and used his knowledge to develop Pakistan's nuclear weapons. And because he was an entrepreneur, he then assisted North Korea to develop its nuclear weapons. South Africa developed nuclear weapons based on their nuclear power station. By the way, South Africa is the only nuclear weapons country that actually terminated, after it successfully making nuclear weapons, it terminated its program and dismantled it. None of the others, of course, have done that. So nuclear power can be a cloak and a resource for developing nuclear weapons, and in fact a number of countries attempted to do that but fortunately discontinued their programs. Algeria, Argentina, Australia in the 1960s, where they started to build a nuclear power station at Jervis Bay, but fortunately they only got as far as the foundations, and a change of Prime Minister terminated that program. And you can read all about it in Richard Bronowski's book, Fact or Fiction. Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Libya, South Korea and Taiwan. These are all countries that use the so-called peaceful nuclear cycle to try and develop nuclear weapons, and mostly discontinued for political reasons. Now, you've heard from Sylvia about nuclear waste, which is another serious problem. I'd like to add to that the risk of nuclear accidents. There have been many, many nuclear accidents, but the most serious were the accident in the former Soviet Union at Kishtim in 1957, the partial meltdown in the United States at 3 Mile Island in 1979, which could have led to a huge disaster. They almost got there, not quite. And of course, Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986 and Fukushima Daiichi in Japan in 2011. What many people do not know, and what the media doesn't tell you, was that when the tsunami struck the Fukushima nuclear power station and leading to the meltdown of 3 of its 6 reactors, further down the coast at a place called Kamizu, Japan had a small wind farm in the surf. The tsunami went straight through the wind farm, and the wind farm continued to generate for some time afterwards until the grid went down, and when the grid was repaired, the wind farm continued to generate. I think that gives you an idea of the difference between the threats of the 2 different technologies. Now, we're told by the coalition that they plan to build nuclear reactors in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and so on. South Australia will reach 100% renewable electricity in 2 or 3 years. I mean, where is the room for nuclear power? Now, it's true that the electricity demand will grow as we electrify transport and electrify combustion heating, but they really, in South Australia, they don't have to work very hard to maintain 100% renewable electricity, which ultimately will become 100% renewable all energy. New South Wales and Victoria are quite well advanced with renewables, although they're not going as fast as they should. They too will be at 100% renewable, wind and solar, long before any nuclear reactor, any nuclear power station could be built in New South Wales and Victoria. So the only way the coalition can get their nuclear power stations built is if they basically force the closure of renewable energy projects, and they restrict the ability of households to feed sunshine off their roof in the form of solar electricity into the grid. The safest and least expensive energy pathway for Australia is to reject nuclear power, to accelerate progress towards 100% renewable energy. And by the way, don't believe the nonsense you're told about 100% renewable energy allegedly not being possible. Scotland already generates 113% of its electricity consumption from renewables, mostly wind supplemented by hydro. It actually generates more than it uses in Scotland, and the difference is exported. South Australia and Denmark are already at 70% renewables, and they will hit 100% in terms of electricity generation before 2030. So we have to accelerate our progress in renewable energy, cancel AUKUS, of course, and cancel the forced posture agreement, which is also a very nasty one that doesn't get much publicity, that allows the visits of nuclear submarines from the US and potentially nuclear-armed B-52s. Nuclear power stations are too dangerous because of proliferation, nuclear waste, and nuclear accidents. They're too dangerous, they're too expensive, they're too slow to build, and they're too inflexible in operation to be good partners for wind and solar. There's no way that we need a nuclear power industry in Australia.